Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting author to introduce you tonight. Tom Czitron is his name. He is the editor of the Investment Survival newsletter. He's a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail. He's a former fund investment individual from Bay Street with numerous different financial organizations, and he's a commenter on where we are from an economic and investment standpoint. And I've read him quite frequently recently and thought that it would be great to have him on our show talking a little bit about where we're headed. And the most recent article that I think I saw was something about the rise of nationalism in the West and its investment implications that are guaranteed to trigger some changes that are a little bit stark. So welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So you write quite frequently. What motivates you to write all these opinion pieces?
I guess I first of all, I really enjoy it. I love following economic news. And also I found that in the last bunch of years, as I sort of transitioned into semi-retirement, I had more time. And because I was just sort of on my own and I was independent, that I could really speak my mind. And what I was seeing is I was seeing a lot. I mean, I do write a lot on sort of generic investment topics, where we are in the market. But I was also interested in the fact that, it seemed to me a bunch of years ago we were headed down a bad road in terms of our economic growth. And, we've seen what's happened in Canada, where we haven't really grown, depending on how you measure it, for about 6 to 8 years. The average Canadian, depending on how you define it, is significantly poorer than he was. And the way I back that up, there's a kind of an interesting thing that I looked at. I looked at average wages in the last 8 years, since 8, 9, since 2015. I subtracted average rent and average food cost, and I looked at the residual, and I recognized that averages aren't, nobody's average in everything, and there's large dispersions, but that residual amount was a lot less. I'm also seeing things in Europe that they are not growing either. So it became very interesting, and I sort of look back at, my youth when I was, starting out in the business. And it was a very different time. It was a time of optimism. You had growth rates during the 80s that were, frankly, unbelievable and phenomenal by today's, comparisons. So, I like to do a lot of investigation on that, I determining what was the difference. And, we're in a very interesting time. And I think the second thing is politically, what I have noticed is whether we like it or not, whether we're for it or not, there's a big political sea change happening with the rise of populism. It started with Brexit, continued with Trump, and it's continuing to this day. And we saw that a couple of weeks ago with the European Parliament. So as somebody who, as an old boss told me, don't trade your politics, but always look at the politics, but be dispassionate about it. And so I tried to sort of determine going forward how this was going to change the investment environment.
Fascinating conversation. Let's just talk about the politics for a second. It looks like this week you could see the UK vote overwhelmingly to go to the left, to Labour. And some pollsters are suggesting the Conservative Party might go down to a dismal defeat. And they're quoting, comparable to what happened to the Conservatives after Brian Mulroney left. And the Conservatives ended up in Canada with 2 seats. And they're saying it could be comparable in the UK. 14 years, I think it is, since the last Labour government in the United Kingdom. And at the same time, in France, it looks like they're going the opposite direction. That that the far right or the right are at an ascendancy. They certainly were in, as you mentioned, the European parliamentary elections, and the center and the left look like they're going to, the center might disappear and the left might be in second place. The current ruling party might be in third place or nowhere. and the right is going to be in ascendancy. So,
Yeah, I mean,
how do you look at Britain and France going in opposite directions?
well, I think they're the countries are unique in their political structure. I think that's part of it. With respect to Britain, they're an outlier. I think what happened in Britain is you had, as you said, I think the Tories have been in power for 15 years, 14 years. They've governed very much as a central party, definitely to the left of what sort of the conservative spirit is right now. People are very frustrated there with the economy. They're very frustrated with what they see as a migration crisis. And there just was a political vacuum. I don't think they really like the Tory. They don't. They're not really flooding to Labor at all. I think what's happening is the Tories are just collapsing. You're seeing votes go to the Reform Party UK, which might is in a statistical tie or whatever right now with the Tories, which is the Nigel Farage party, which is, considered far right. I don't really think it is, but it's much more of a conservative populist party. And you have I guess there's another party there that's more centrist, and they're hanging in there. So that's really what
The
you're
Liberal
getting.
Democrats.
Liberal Democrats, because even in Canada, the collapse of the Conservatives after Mulroney under Kim Campbell was partially a result of I guess Preston Manning's party growing and people just getting tired. In the case of France, that's kind of more typical of what's happening. Macron really party really got devastated in the election, Euro election. Now he called a snap election, which really might blow up on his face. So we'll see how that goes. But I mean, the French are also very frustrated. Macron is a much more of a centrist. I think. I don't think he's certainly not like a left, far left politician. So I think that the middle is kind of the middle might be collapsing. I mean, getting back to Labor in the UK. I mean, like I said, they're not that popular, but there's certain aspects of the vote that they have, and I mean, just to be a little bit, edgy on this, what I guess I worry about is you're seeing in a lot of nations sort of a bifurcation of the voters. So on one case, you have voters who are more conservative. They might be much more capitalistically inclined, not totally capitalistically, but they're not, but they're much more free market oriented. And unfortunately, you have this growing class of people who are really quite reliant on government, and they want more and more, and they see themselves maybe as interest groups, so they'll vote for Labor. Like for instance, a lot of the Muslim community in the UK is coming out for Labor, or seems to be coming up for Labor. That's just sort of a special interest thing. The Labor Party, and even though they're courting the Muslim community, they really have nothing in common with conservative Muslims, who have on various social issues completely disagree with them. So I think that's kind of what you're seeing, and it's going to be
So they're
interesting.
voting for their economic interests, not their social beliefs.
Right, and also the economic interests. Let's not confuse economic interests that are perceived with the real ones. The real economic interests might be in kind of more of a free market, meritocracy, like I mean, it's a bit aspirational, but we used to have. And some of them, and I'm going to be very frank about this, a lot of people, and even in Canada, because we have so many social programs or so many industries that are government subsidized now, which you take for granted, like our film industry, for instance. I do a lot of work in the film industry. It's heavily government subsidized, even though it's still in the private sector, and people are paid very well. People are working in that industry who might, and there's a lot of industries like that who might not be working at that high in income. So you do have this situation where I think people are kind of have all these decades have gotten more dependent on the government, and I saw that when I was younger, when the Iron Curtain fell. And I think it wasn't thought of at the time, and it was largely forgotten. But I spoke to a lot of people who came out of that system, and they had a really hard time adjusting to doing everything themselves. Finding like a good job, building up their skills. Like it really was like letting a domesticated animal out into the wild to some extent. So
letting a domesticated animal out into the wild and not being able to handle it. A fascinating analogy. We got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back with Tom in just 2 minutes, and we're going to ask him about this trend and how it's impacted Canada, because he's actually arguing for nationalism or nationalistic ideas and tendencies and desires in Western Canada, and he thinks that is going to impact where we should be investing. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is economics in Canada, the economic prospects of Canada, but we've also touched on sort of trends globally as well. Our guest is Tom Czitron, who is an investment editor of Investment Survival newsletter. He's a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail. He's a commentator on economics and on investment. And you wrote recently in the Globe an article about the rise of nationalism in the West and its investment implications. Mm-hmm. What was your argument, sir?
Well, my argument was it was going back to sort of Reagan's 5 principles. As I said earlier, the 80s were a great time. It wasn't all because of economic policy. Some of it was luck, demographics, the invention of the personal computer and other technologies. But Reagan had 5 principles, and I'm going to remember them now, where he had reduced government spending, contrary to what people think. He didn't cut spending at all. He just lowered the growth in spending. But aspirationally, I think he wanted to cut, but he couldn't. Lower taxes, which he did, and that resulted in a bit of a spike in the debt levels and deficits. But the debt levels were very low by comparison back then. He advocated lower regulation, free trade, and sound money. And in terms of nationalism, there's certain things, this growing nationalistic movement, there's certain things that they agree with, I think, on the and again, I don't want to oversimplify them, because you have everyone from dyed in the wool, very sort of neo right wing, maybe we could call them like maybe bad actors. We have people who are kind of in the middle, and they get maligned by a lot of the mainstream press, but they're actually fairly moderate. And then you have like somebody like Milei of Argentina, who's technically an anarchist, so he's not really in that group, even though he gets lumped in. But in those things, I mean, that I said about Reagan, I mean, they do definitely want lower taxes. Some of it is it's going to take a lot more time, even if they get power, to have that. I mean, I've heard some ludicrous ideas that on the right, that the far right, that income taxes should be completely abolished and just replaced by tariffs. Well, that would be a disaster. So they want lower taxes, less government spending, which I think is doable, considering that government spending as a percent of GDP and per population has gone up so much. You could cut government spending by about 40% and still have more government spending than we experienced in the 80s. So those are positive. The things I would like worry about is the nationalist movement tends to be quite protectionist, and that will have very negative implications going forward. The other thing is the whole sound money argument, where you know I'm finding a lot of nationalists are not really they're not really preaching. I mean, they're not really enacting what they preach, because they preach sound money, and maybe even going back to the gold standards, and yet they are jumping up and down for an artificial reduction in interest rates. Well, those two beliefs are contradictory.
So this nationalism argument or trend I find interesting, because I don't see how it is consistent with a lot of the sort of the free enterprise capitalism arguments that you make. It's almost as if free enterprise is okay within my own borders, but not within the globe. And I'm going to establish sort of big tariff barriers and regulatory barriers to not allow this thing that I argue for, free trade, low regulation, no barriers within my border, to exist within the globe. And you've written another article about deglobalization and its implications on investment. So reconcile for me, if you could, this sort of more conservative attitude toward lower taxes, lower regulation, more free enterprise, but then setting up borders and tariff barriers and regulatory barriers to make it less able to do that globally.
Well, Brian, you bring up an excellent point, because they are contradictory. Lower taxes and less government spending, empirically, from what I can see, will help, as a bit of a economic historian, does help economic growth. Trade barriers hurts economic growth almost, logically. I mean, you go back to Ricardo's what is it?
Theory of comparative advantage.
Yeah, and that has been shown to work. So that is a really big negative. And, lest we forget, the two things, no matter what anyone argues, the two things that really put the U.S. especially into the Great Depression was Smoot-Hawley, which was a trade bill, and
with tariff barriers.
Yeah, with tariff barriers, and like a really mishandling of the money supply, allowing the money supply to just crater. So it is contradictory, and so when I look at this whole nationalist versus what they call globalist, I don't know if that's a fair. The name is got a really emotional content to it. Some of the people out there who use the term globalist a lot are conspiracy theorists. But there is this dynamic right now in the world economy where, who is more important? Who's running the show? Is it groups like international groups, or is it the nation state? And part of the problem is, I think, well, first of all, there's an issue around, and I've studied this in terms of looking at different countries, and for reasons that might be a little beyond me, I'm good at seeing the output, maybe a little less with the reason, but countries that are small, Western countries that are small, tend to do a lot better. The exception is the United States, which seems to do well all the time. But, you have countries like Switzerland, Sweden, a lot of Scandinavian countries, and now Eastern Europe, which have relatively small populations, are doing well. You also see that in Winnipeg, in Singapore. And there might be a period where a country gets so big in terms of people, it gets unmanageable. So, it might just be a coincidence, but Canada seemed to be a lot happier country, and we were way ahead I think we were in the top 5 at one point in standard of living, and now we're probably in the mid to low 20s, headed towards the 30s, when we were, now that we're 40 million. So there might be something to say about decentralization. And maybe that was a part of the reason. It wasn't the whole reason. It wasn't even the majority, but maybe that's one of the reasons that North America did so well, because we were broken up into provinces and states in the U.S. So, there's that aspect of it. The other aspect is, there's, I think by the definition of the UN, there's 200 countries in the world. Um, you can't trade with all of them. Not all of them are your friends. I think the way you calculate it is something like there's 17,000 combinations of trading partners in the world. Um, you can't trade with all of them. And, I think what they call globalism, things like the UN, the World Bank, the World Bank and IMF gets really, I think, really unfairly maligned. There's issues around them, but they're not, these monsters that conspiracy theorists say. But there's some issues around that. But if every country was like Europe and North America, it would be a lot easier to have that regime. Where it's hard is there's so many different countries, they have so many different cultures, and they're so different on their economic, where they are economically.
So, you raise a really interesting issue about these forces against globalization, or arguments against globalization, and some of them being conspiracy theorists, etc. I don't understand something. A decade ago, the people that were against globalization, the people that were protesting G7 meetings and the like, were the left that had real problems with the IMF and the Washington Consensus and globalization, etc. Today, it seems like it's the right that is against, and the conspiracy theorists on the right that believe that that the Soros and the World Economic Forum are trying to run our lives from Davos, and that the IMF and the World Bank are trying to take our sovereignty away from us and impose globalist ideals on us. Why has it gone from the left disagreeing with global institutions and organizations to now it's the right that is disagreeing with global organizations?
Well, I mean, the left still disagrees with like the far left still disagrees with globalization. So when I say the far left, I mean the guys who are down at the University of Toronto, the Free Palestine guys, those left wing, the Antifa guys, they're still against it. I think this sort of moderate left never was really against it. It was part of the order. It was just a question of, with the left and the right were fairly moderate. So it was, who's going to win this year, the Leafs or the Canadians? Well, they're both Canadian hockey teams, but, they're a little different orientation. But, now you have the emergence of this far right, which are, before the internet, they were, and Twitter and some others, social media platforms, they were the underbelly. Like there was, like, even when I was in high school, there was always these crazy guys who wanted to like resurrect the Third Reich, and they were kind of clowns, right? But now, like, they're getting these these like ecosystems, these cults around them, and it's really, I mean, I try to be kind of sanguine about it, but I'm going to admit it kind of scares me. You have people like, I don't even want to mention them, to maybe I should, to give them publicity, but there's these far right guys who are just, they're lunacy. Like there's no political coherence to what their view. They just hate this group or that group. And they're having like, some of these guys have over 1 million subscribers. So, there's 1 million guys, hearing this stuff. And, I've been following Soros for a long time. And I read his first book, The Alchemy of Finance, because he was the pioneer of the hedge fund. And I wanted to learn back then what a hedge fund is. Like we're talking, over 30 years ago. And when you read his book, he's really got some really flaky political philosophies. And I sort of took that he was just a portfolio manager when I read that book. And he, he had some flaky political philosophies, but I didn't take him seriously because at the time, every business writer would always put in his 2 cents, a lot of end of the world stuff, a little bit conspiratorial, but I mean, he has morphed into a guy who is definitely, on the left. And so he's become a target for a lot of people.
Is he
Um,
trying to run the
you know,
world?
is he trying to run the world? Well, if he is, he's not doing a great job, is he?
Is the World
I don't think he's
Economic
trying to
Forum
run.
trying to run the world?
I think the World Economic. Well, first of all, one thing I always found was funny about the World Economics Forum is because it's been around for a long time. It's only been in the last year, I could say 7 years, where it's become controversial. It used to be like, to my view, it used to be just a conference for economic geeks and some government, officials. And having been in Bay Street since 1980, some of this stuff, like going to Davos, it's not really that political. A lot of it is just going and taking and skiing, and if it's summer, golf and this. So it's more of a convention, right? And they do believe in certain things, but you know it, it used to be sort of kind of consensus. They've been kind of, as like everybody in the elite has gone to the left, especially with all this global climate change stuff. It's become like, it gets a lot of criticism, but I don't think it has the power that its opponents really think. It's just a think tank. They have their opinion, other people's have theirs. They just got bigger and more into it. I mean, I think what is happening, and I don't know the answer where this goes, but from 1945 to, let's call it, COVID 2020, there was a big hiccup in 2008. We had this international, financial infrastructure that was evolving, and we didn't want a repeat of World War I and World War II, obviously, and it's worked pretty well for the that's what, 75 years. I mean, that's a pretty good run for a system to have. um, and now we're in need of transitioning to another one, and you have all these competing elements. You have the far right, you have nationalism, but you also have, old style kind of eco socialism. You've got the Antifa types who, even though you just see them protest, they have a lot of TV shows, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of YouTubers and stuff who get you know, hundreds of thousands of views. Some of these people are out. They're getting more views than CNN. So we'll see how it goes. I mean, I think it'll all work out eventually, but uh, you might have a lot of problems, and you might have some serious problems, and much more serious problems in certain countries than others.
Well,
So
this has been a really interesting canvas of sort of what's going on politically and economically globally. Let's take a break for some messages and come back and talk about Canada
sure.
and the Canadian prospects and what you think what's going on right now. We're going to come back in 2 minutes, everyone, with Tom Czitron, a columnist at the Globe and Mail, a regular columnist, contributing columnist, and a former very involved financial executive on Bay Street. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Tom Czitron about sort of the economy. We've been talking about the role that economy and politics and sort of populism globally has been having on both politics and the economics in the last little while. And I want to turn to Canada now. But Tom, let's start out by telling everyone a little bit about you and your background. So I understand that you worked for a couple of decades on Bay Street. Is that correct?
Correct. About three, actually, a little over three. Yeah.
Doing what?
I started off in 1980 as a credit analyst for the then Dominion Bond Rating Service. So I was a financial analyst. I looked at companies. Interestingly enough, that was before PCs, so I had to do everything from a manual. Well, it wasn't manual; it was electric. Thank goodness, adding machine. I transitioned there and ended up in at Canada Permanent, which eventually became Canada Trust, which was taken over by TD. And I was responsible for basically at a young age. I'm not sure this was that wise on the part of my bosses. I was responsible for the top left-hand side of the company's balance sheet. So basically all the liquid investments and including the stock portfolio. And then I ended up for
You worked for Red Ed.
Red Ed.
Ed
No, I
Clark.
was there before him. I'm really old. I never met Red Ed.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Um, I'll tell you one thing about Red Ed. Here was a guy who did the National Energy Program, which arguably was the start of the end of Canada, but he ran a good company. Like he was a pretty good manager from what, people would told me about him. Um, so I did most of my career at Royal Bank, at first at Royal Trust, and then after the merger at Royal Bank. So I was first running pension funds, and then they had me do mutual funds. And then I worked for Scepter Investments. So I've had a pretty varied career. I was known primarily as a bond guy, but later in my career, I was pretty much effectively, doing like chief investment officer stuff. So I was responsible for all the income funds, like all the income stuff. So everything from REITs to bonds to money market to the dividend paying program, and sort of asset mix. I was on the asset mix committee, and it was always very interesting. I've been very fortunate that way.
And have you been writing and columns through your whole career or just recently?
Just recently, I mean, I always liked writing. Um, Back in the 80s, I technically had a column on the Canadian bond market for a Japanese publication. So I would send it to this was at the Royal Trust. I would send it to our office in Tokyo. And we had a guy there who was, a fluent Japanese speaker, and he would translate my work. So God knows what I appeared to say in the Japanese publication. I also really always liked writing. Um, so I was, I tended to volunteer for things like the quarterly and weekly, even weekly reports. So like I was writing reports all the time. So
So let's
I don't know
turn
if,
let's turn to Canada if we could. Some people
okay.
think that we're in an economic malaise. Our real disposable income has been flat or down. Our productivity, our prosperity is down.
Mhm.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. Tell me, what do you think of where Canada is economically right now?
Well, I think Canada is made some real mistakes. I think coincidentally, I remember. I don't remember the exact date. I think it was maybe in early. It was obviously early in the year, but I remember going to university and seeing Marc Lalonde, who was the finance minister, deliver a speech um, about the national energy program. And for some reason, that seems to be where we peaked as a country. We've been going down relatively slowly to the United States. I mean, I look at these numbers all the time. Sometimes we seem to fall at certain points behind the United States more than others, and sometimes we sort of keep up with it. There were kind of two major downdrafts in standard of living. That was in the, I guess, early 90s when we had our debt crisis, right, where we were downgraded, and the Chrétien government and Paul Martin brought in more austerity, and we sort of reversed that a bit. And in the last sort of, quite frankly, 9 years, we've also had a lot of issues, and I think they've been, especially lately, I think they've been own goals, right? I mean, I think we we had too much government spending. At one point, I mean, I think we increased the number and I saw this in Statistics Canada, the number of civil servants by 100,000, or, about 40% or something crazy like that. Taxes are still pretty high. The government has implemented a capital gains tax, so they're raising, and the carbon tax, so they're raising taxes during really an economic crisis. And I don't think we're in a recession, but I think we're in technically, but we have been in a mild depression for a while.
I think we're I think we're technically in a per capita recession, but not a
Definitely,
overall
yeah.
recession because of the growth in the population.
Yeah, I think the last quarter had positive growth even per capita, but we're not in great shape by any stretch of the imagination. So
So
before
what?
everybody get
So why? We've got great natural resources. We've got great universities. We've got a growing population. Why this, economic malaise? Why is our productivity, I think I've heard 40% below what the United States is. I think that the median incomes haven't grown, as you say, in like 8 to 15 years in
oh,
real terms.
as
So
far as
what is going
productivity goes,
on?
well, as far as productivity goes, like when the government allocates or sets interest rate policy and also government policy where they're moving capital out of productive areas like the private sector and into state-sponsored type of enterprises, that's going to lower productivity. It just is, and it just you brought up, like, I think 3 points. So we have resources. That's absolutely true. But I mean, I heard this. I don't know. It sounds crazy to me. But to build a new mine in Canada, it takes 15 years. We all know how, we have a very strong environmental movement. So it's very tough to put in pipelines. It's very tough to put in new railroads. It's very tough to have, new oil and gas development. So that's killing our productivity.
So if I could
We're
interrupt
not
you for a second and correct you, it takes 2 to 3 years to build that mine. It takes 10 to 12 years to get it approved.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's a good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah, like the building the mine only takes a couple of years. The approval is, and the funny thing about that number with 15 is, I don't know about you, but I'm not the same guy I was 15 years ago. So if I'm working on a mine at 45 to start it, and that mine is not gonna take an ounce of ore out of the ground when I'm 60, I'm not gonna bother. It's just you know and also, like, the rate of returns and the cost of capital, it doesn't make sense. So you brought up resources. Now you brought up universities. The issue around universities is our universities are okay. They're not as good as they were. But and this is probably a bit of controversial idea, but we used to have, and this is true of all the Western world, we used to have, when I was going to university, only about 15% of people had a university degree. Now it's 40%. 80% of the people who go to university plus are going to the humanities. They're going to sociology and things like that. They're not going to things like STEM or business schools, which add to the productivity. So where this cohort of people who are in university now who wouldn't be in university when I was a kid, they're in jobs that are not productive. Like they're doing NGOs, some of them, if they're lucky, and being overpaid that way. But a lot, some of them are in tech, which are doing well. A lot of them are in, call centers. They're, in Toronto, you hear stories of like four, 28-year-olds living together because they can't afford anything. So the universities have really, I don't think, we're not seeing a lot of, I mean, there's pockets of excellence like Waterloo, but I'm kind of a little skeptical. I guess. Okay, so fair disclosure here. My MBA degree is from the University of Toronto. My daughter has 2 degrees at University of Toronto. Her mom has a degree, two degrees at the University Toronto. Actually, I think one or master's degree. So we're a University of Toronto family. And I've been down to Convocation Hall twice, and I've seen those protesters just take over those lawns and make them into a cesspool. And that's not my, if that's university, you can have it, because it just, it's not what university is supposed to be. So I don't think, I think that's an issue. Also, you brought up population. Well, here's the thing about population, and it's very simple. Population, immigration is good for the economy overall, all things being equal, but all things are not equal. So what are the things? It's a question of, and I'll go with immigration on this. It's a question of who's immigrating. If you're getting immigrants in who are highly educated, highly entrepreneurial, that's going to turbocharge your economy. If you get immigrants in who are, have no job skills, are frankly, they're not very well educated, even enough to exist in an industrialized society. That's, and I know it's a sensitive issue, but that's going to be an issue, and it's going to decrease your productivity. Even with, let's say, net productive people coming into the country, you also have to give them an opportunity. If you don't give them an opportunity, if you're having mining engineers come into the country, highly trained, it's a very high cognitive specialty. But you don't open any mines, there's no jobs for them, so they're driving cabs. And I experienced this because about a year ago, I tore my Achilles tendon, and I had to go like every week for physio, to the hospital, and I always took an Uber because I was in a cast. And I had, people who were like doctors who had master's degrees driving me in the Uber. So you're not doing them a great service. And I heard their stories where they're working two jobs and they can barely afford to live. Well, you're not sort of taking advantage of your population that way.
It's interesting. I've done interviews with people that have studied the immigration system in Canada in great detail, and we actually have the highest percentage of economic educated immigrants ever. So we're doing a really good job of attracting very highly educated people and people that have got good economic prospects. But as you say, once they come here, we're doing a terrible job of actually acknowledging and accepting their educational qualifications and integrating them into society and giving them jobs. So we do a good job of attracting them and bringing them here, but do a terrible job of actually giving them jobs and helping them to employ. We have about 12 to 15% of the people that are economic immigrants that are coming with substantial wealth that we hope to have come and invest and grow businesses. Within 18 to 24 months, we lose a lot of them to the United States. So they come here and they start, and then they leave again. And so I think that, and one thing that Australia and New Zealand do well is they actually get people to get jobs before they come. We don't allow that primarily, and we want them to get jobs once they're here, or we don't at least, increase their qualifications if they get jobs before they come. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
We're going to have to turn. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one thing we probably should look at is, when we talk about sort of educated immigrants versus years ago, back in, like 50 to 100 years ago, it was a very different world. So we tended to, and this might obscure the data a bit, we tended to get a lot of European immigrants who on paper were poorly educated and poor. But in reality, they had just been held back by, the European class system. So there was no opportunity for, people 100 years ago, from working class backgrounds in Europe like there is now. So they came to North America and they ended up, doing quite well. But they were smart to begin with. They just, again, didn't have the opportunities that we have now.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask Tom what he would do if he was in charge. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really interesting conversation tonight with Tom Czitron, who is a regular contributing columnist at the Globe and Mail. He's got a long history, couple decades, 3 decades, working on Bay Street. Tom, there's been some criticism lately of our politics, frankly, with all parties in Ottawa, that we don't have enough people that have got Bay Street experience or business experience, that we have career politicians and lawyers and whatnot, but we don't have people. And they go back to, the Jim Flahertys and the Paul Martins, the Mark Lalondes of this world that had Bay Street, John Turner, that had Bay Street experience, that had business experience, that could represent, the financial aspects of this world in cabinet, if not at the top level of the PMO. If you were in charge, what would you do differently?
Well, if I was in charge, and I guess I had dictatorial powers, I would just do like the whole Reagan stuff. I would cut taxes. The average Canadian is paying more than twice, adjusted for inflation, than he was even like in the 80s. So there's a lot of things you can cut back because the 80s were not terrible. I can assure you that. So you cut that. You cut back spending. You cut back taxes. You cut regulation, and I think it would be rather surprising. Like we might not go back from 25th highest standard of living to fourth in a few years, but we would be well on our way to doing well. Reagan once said, some things are simple, but they're not easy. So I think that the advantage of Canada has is we've been doing so many, frankly, things that are maladaptive, that if we just stop doing them and go back to normal, we'll do really well. And even something like the budget, the budget and the debt levels. Like people are panicking about the debt levels, and they should, because there seems to be a point where debt levels get so big that things, you don't necessarily get a debt crisis, but you'll get maybe a generation of poor economic performance. We saw that in Japan, which went from the richest country in the world, far richer per capita than the US, to like a lot less than the US. So you have that, and it would be pretty simple. Like, for instance, if you ran a balanced budget, I'm not even talking about a surplus, but a balanced budget, and you had 2.5% inflation and 2.5% growth, within a generation, you could get the debt to GDP ratio from 100 eventually back down to like 60% or 50, which is very manageable. So we have problems, but they are fixable. They are fixable at this point. If we have sort of rational government. I mean, if the whole place falls apart and we end up like, Quebec ends up saying, we've had it if you're not going to pay us, and Alberta gets fed up with the way they're being treated with their resources in Ottawa, the whole thing could break down. But I think it's a very solvable problem. It just, and this is the kind of frustrating thing for me, having been in the corporate world, is that in the corporate world, if the company starts struggling, you identify why it's struggling, and you just fix it if you can, right? And there might be forces beyond your control, but there's a lot of, you can make the best of any situation. But because government is so politicized for obvious reasons, they can't just run it like a corporation, say, okay, so these are our problems. What's the solution? Okay, we know the solution. Do the strategy. What are the tactics? And just go. And we don't seem to want to do that anywhere in the Western world.
So you say that in private corporations, if you have a problem, you'd identify the problem and try to solve it. What do you think we do in politics?
We just go on and we blame our opposition. or we blame different interest groups, or even sadly ethnic groups. That's what we do in practice. We try to deflect away from the problem, and I think it's because it's a I mean, politicians love power, right? I mean, I can kind of see that. When I was in Bay Street, I got to hang out with a lot of them, and they just love the trips and the cocktail parties, and having people come over to them and ask them, all these questions because they're so much brighter than everyone. It's a real ego rush, which is why I think that according to some psychologists, I read that a disproportionate amount of corporate CEOs and senior politicians tend to be narcissistic sociopaths, far more
Narcissistic
than the
sociopaths.
yeah, like far more than the regular population. So.
Well, there was this
But I
line
mean,
that politics is Hollywood for ugly people.
Yeah, but like for instance, like I could never be a politician because I like to speak my mind, but also I tend to be fairly introverted, and I like my books and stuff and reading. I can't see knocking on a door, like knocking on door after door, asking people for my vote. And when they ask me why are you better than the next guy? Well, I don't know if I'm better than the next guy. The next guy might be better than me just because he's in a different political party. Right?
Tom,
So
you've identified, some concerns globally. You've identified some real problems domestically. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about our future in Canada?
I'm optimistic in Canada, but subject to us being active. So I will say this: I don't think our problems are going to go away by themselves. I think they're going to have to be worked on. But if we work on them, I think people, not next year or the year after, but 10 years from now, they'll be really surprised, and they'll look back and say, "Wow, we got out of this." But it really depends, and I don't want to be too partisan, but it seems like the current government and some of the past provincial governments, they just wouldn't change, right? They were like that corporation which wouldn't change how they ran things and ran themselves into the ground. So there's going to have to be some changes. I mean, you saw that on the provincial level where you had a lot of left of center governments. Particularly in the three big, we're a federal system and the provinces are very important to the economy, but the three biggest provinces, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, had leadership for decades, economically, which, their track record speaks for themselves. It wasn't impressive, at all. And, they were changed, and maybe it's a little better now. So, I'm optimistic if we do what's right, and from a competition point of view, if we do a few good things, and let's say Europe continues to kind of screw up, we might look really well. We might look really good compared to Europe in a decade.
Tom Czitron, thanks so much for joining us.
But you appreciate it. Okay,
that's our show for tonight, everybody.
Pleasure.
We've had a really good review of economics and politics and populism internationally, as well as Tom's assessment of what's going on in Canada. And given all of the concerns he's got, he's still optimistic, but we've got to make some change. That's my show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. All my shows go on social media as soon as they go to air. Thanks for joining me. Good night, everybody.